Let go of my wife.
His fist was already tangled in her curls when he noticed the swell of her stomach. "You're pregnant," Travis hissed, his knuckles white as he yanked her head back, forcing Maya to gasp in pain while her hand instinctively shielded her 6-month bump. The luxury storefronts of the mall blurred into a smear of gold and white as she stumbled, her brown leather handbag hitting the marble floor with a heavy thud. And that's when the rhythmic clicking of polished dress shoes approached. The man walking toward them didn't shout. He didn't break his stride. But when he said, "Let go of my wife," the bustling mall went deathly silent. Travis had just put his hands on June Hyuk Park's world, and June Hyuk is a man who never leaves a debt unpaid. Before we proceed, if this opening gripped you, subscribe now if you are new here so you never miss what's ahead. While you're here, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing our community grow. Now, let's dive into the story. The iced Americano Maya had been carrying was a dark, dripping ruin across the white marble, but she didn't look down. It was a habit she developed somewhere between the 4 years of being told she was defective and the woman she was becoming now, the need to stay perfectly still even when her world was crashing. Her therapist would probably have a lot to say about her inability to move, but Maya hadn't mentioned it yet. Some scars were too deep to hand over to a stranger with a notepad. The mall off the main plaza moved around her in the easy, unhurried way of a Thursday afternoon. Designer logos glowed from the walls, casting pools of expensive light across the polished floors. The scent of high-end perfume and fresh leather drifted from the nearby boutiques. Soft, ambient music filled the space, nothing urgent, nothing sharp. It was exactly the kind of normal atmosphere June Hyuk had chosen deliberately when he suggested she meet his mother here for lunch. He wanted Maya to feel discreet, comfortable, and far enough from his syndicate world that she could breathe without looking over her shoulder for a security rotation. He wanted her to feel like she wasn't a target. But as Travis's grip tightened on her hair, Maya realized the shadow of her past didn't care about the safety of a luxury mall. The white marble floor of the mall felt suddenly like thin ice, cracking beneath Maya's sandals the moment that voice cut through the ambient hum of the afternoon. It was a voice that sounded like heavy doors slamming shut and the low, dangerous hum of a storm before the sky turns black. It was a voice she had spent 14 months and 3 weeks trying to scrub from the lining of her brain, a sound she had buried under new routines, a new name, and the steady, quiet warmth of a man who actually loved her. But in the space of a single breath, the 3 syllables of her name, Maya, landed like a precise blade, finding the exact unguarded place she thought she had healed. She didn't look up immediately. She couldn't. Instead, her body reacted with a primal memory that 14 months of therapy hadn't quite managed to erase. Every muscle in her shoulders tightened, her posture shrinking instinctively as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible. It was the internalized smallness she had learned during 4 years of being told she was a transaction gone wrong, a woman who had tricked a man into a barren life. She felt the air temperature drop, a phantom chill that moved from the back of her neck to the flat of her palm, which was currently pressed against the swell of her stomach. When she finally forced her gaze upward, Travis Kane was standing less than 6 feet away, his presence an aggressive stain on the luxury backdrop of the mall. He was dressed in a navy suit that was tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders, his hair groomed with the kind of severe perfection that signaled control was the only point of his existence. He didn't look shocked. Shock was too fleeting an emotion for a man like Travis. Instead, as his eyes dropped to her stomach, Maya watched his expression curdle into something hot and ugly, a familiar darkness working its way up from beneath his polished surface. The mall noise continued around them, the sound of distant laughter, the chime of a boutique door, the rhythmic clicking of heels on stone. But the space between Maya and Travis went completely, terrifyingly silent. She felt the nearest shoppers glance over, sensing the jagged edge of the tension, before they quickly looked away, retreating into the bystander paralysis that always seemed to follow Travis like a shadow. "You're pregnant." His voice was quiet, a dangerous register she had learned to dread more than his shouting. His jaw tightened, and she saw the familiar curl of his right hand at his side, the one with the old scar across the knuckle. He stepped closer, the scent of his expensive cologne, a smell that used to mean safety but now meant suffocation, filling her lungs. 4 years, Maya. 4 years of you telling me you were the reason we couldn't. and now you're carrying another man's child." Maya's hand pressed firmer against her belly, a reflex of protection that her mind hadn't even instructed her to perform. Her eyes didn't drop this time. They held his with the steady, exhausted calm of a woman who had already walked through the fire he was trying to light. She remembered the promise she made to herself the day she signed the divorce papers. She would never again move quickly around Travis Kane, never flinch, and never give him the satisfaction of watching her scramble. "It's none of your business, Travis," she said, her voice sounding steadier than her pulse felt. But Travis had always hated being dismissed, hated being made to feel irrelevant in a story he believed he authored. He stepped closer still, his eyes sweeping the mall to ensure he had an audience, even if they were pretending not to watch. He repeated her words back to her like they were an absurdity, his jaw working with a raw, disorganized pride that wore the clothing of grief. "You planned this," he whispered, and the quietness of it was worse. "You knew the whole time you could get pregnant. You let me believe it was you. You humiliated me." Maya felt the weight of the 4 years he had handed her his shame, and called it truth. She remembered the doctor visits he refused to attend, the tests he wouldn't take because he knew he was fine, and the way he had stopped reaching for her hand in public the moment he decided she was a faulty appliance. "You never got tested," she reminded him, her voice a flat line. "I asked you, the doctors asked you, you refused." The truth didn't set him free, it made him move. Before she could process the shift, his hand moved, not toward her throat, but upward, his fingers tangling into her voluminous black curls with a force that made her head snap back. It wasn't about pain. It was about pinning her, about dragging her back to every room in their old house where she was only as real as his anger allowed. Maya gasped, the air thin and sharp, her hand flying to her stomach as a prayer and a shield. She forced herself to keep her eyes open, to stay present in her body even as the old, terrible distance tried to pull her away. She needed 10 minutes. June Hyuk was supposed to meet her in 10 minutes, and she was not at all certain she had them. The mall had gone completely motionless. A woman near a storefront window put a hand over her mouth. A security guard stood frozen several yards away, caught in that collective freeze of people waiting for someone else to be the first to break the tension. And then, the mall doors at the far end of the corridor slid open. A cold rush of air swept through the building, followed by footsteps, measured, unhurried, and heavy with a kind of quiet efficiency. Maya didn't have to look to know the atmosphere had shifted. The temperature didn't just drop, it crystallized. June Hyuk Park entered the space, his black suit and open collar revealing the dark, deliberate lines of the ink that climbed his neck. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply crossed the marble in 6 strides, his dark eyes moving across the scene with the efficiency of a man who had already decided how the afternoon would end. The rhythmic click of June Hyuk's shoes against the marble floor faded into a distant echo as Maya's mind, battered by the sudden violence of Travis's grip, sought refuge in the only place it knew, the past. The cold air of the mall seemed to transform into the humid, rising steam of a kitchen sink, transporting her back 3 years to a Tuesday evening that had smelled of lemon soap and the metallic tang of a failed promise. She was 26 then, washing the dinner dishes with a care that felt more like a ritual of penance than a household chore. In those early days, Travis had been a master of charming certainty. He was the kind of man who remembered the smallest details, who bought flowers for no reason, and who spoke about their future with a confidence that felt like an anchor. Maya had loved him with a trust she hadn't yet learned to portion out, believing his easy smiles were a map to a life that finally made sense. But the optimism of tracking apps and vitamins had eventually curdled into a clinical scheduling that stripped the romance from their bedroom, leaving behind only the cold, hard math of a year without a positive test. The shift hadn't been an explosion. It was an incremental withdrawal, a slow-moving frost that started with Travis stopping his habit of reaching for her hand in public. On that Tuesday at the sink, the silence in the house had become a physical weight. Maya had been staring at the bubbles in the water when Travis's voice cut through the steam, not with a shout, but with a conversational observation that hit harder than any scream. "You knew something was wrong with you before we got married, didn't you?" he had asked, leaning against the counter and loosening his tie without looking at her. Maya had gone completely still, the soapy water cooling against her wrists. "That's not true," she had whispered, but the words felt flimsy against the wall of his mounting conviction. "Then why can't you give me a child?" he replied. The question had rearranged something fundamental inside her, shifting her balance in the way a wrong step on uneven ground signals a fall before the body even registers the impact. From that moment on, Travis began to treat her like a faulty appliance, a transaction he was still deciding whether to return. He refused to be tested himself, dismissing the doctor's suggestions with a hard-edged pride that claimed he knew he was fine, and therefore the failure was exclusively hers. Over the following months, the cruelty had become his primary language. He called her useless, with the same tone one might use to comment on the weather, and he accused her of running a scheme on him, of tricked him into a marriage she was incapable of fulfilling. She had carried that word, tricked, like a stone in her pocket, letting it wear away at her self-worth until she truly believed she had scammed him out of a legacy. She lost weight, stopped calling her mother so the shame wouldn't be heard in her voice, and gained a quietness that made her invisible even to herself. The memory of the steam and the porcelain sink felt so real that for a moment, Maya almost expected to see the lemon-scented bubbles when she looked down. Instead, she saw the dark, dripping ruin of her spilled coffee on the mall floor and Travis's fingers still white-knuckled in her curls. The shame he had fed her for 4 years was still there, heavy and familiar, but it was being met by a new, colder presence. Jun Hyuk was now only steps away, his shadow falling across them both like a shield. Maya realized then that she had lived through the rubble of one life only to build another from the ruins, and while she was still learning how to inhabit a world where she wasn't defective, she was no longer the woman at the sink. She was a woman who was loved for her existence, not her utility, and the man approaching them was about to make sure Travis Kane understood the difference. The sudden, sharp pressure of Travis's hand in her hair forced Maya's mind to leap once more, escaping the harsh, fluorescent lights of the mall for the soft, amber glow of a small gallery in September. It had been 6 months since she had stood on the pavement in the thin March sunshine, holding her divorce papers and waiting to feel something other than total exhaustion. She had gone to the opening only because a colleague had dragged her there, and she spent most of the evening standing near the back, wearing a dress bought for a version of herself she hadn't yet located. She had been staring at a large abstract canvas, trying to look as though it meant something to her, when a voice spoke from 2 feet away. "It doesn't work," he said. Maya turned to find a man standing with an unhurried posture that suggested he had long ago stopped needing to perform composure. He was dressed in a dark suit with no tie, and it was then that she first noticed the ink, dark, deliberate lines climbing the side of his neck and disappearing beneath his shirt. "The painting," he added, his dark eyes direct without being aggressive. "The scale is wrong for the emotion it's trying to carry. Too wide. It dilutes it." "I thought it was just me," Maya admitted, feeling a strange, low-level shift in her chest. They talked for 40 minutes in front of a painting neither of them liked, and when he suggested they get coffee somewhere quieter, she had said yes before she'd fully decided to. As they sat across from each other at a corner table, Maya realized with a start that she didn't feel the specific alertness she had grown accustomed to around men. There was no background calculation of how much space she was taking up, no fear that her voice was too much, or that she might say the wrong thing and pay for it later in some quiet, deniable way. Jun Hyuk didn't fill the silence with the loud, performative praise Travis used to use to mask his control. Instead, he listened the way very few people do, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said. His silence didn't feel like a withdrawal or a judgment. It felt like a room with the windows finally opened. It was a silence that made her feel safe enough to eventually tell him about the marriage, about the trying, the doctor visits, and the word defective that had been spoken in the kitchen of a house she thought was a home. She told him all of it, and waited for the slight recalibration she expected from every man, the moment his interest would adjust around the complicated facts of who she was. But Jun Hyuk hadn't moved. He looked at her steadily and told her that if she couldn't have children, they would build a family another way, that it wasn't a sacrifice, just a different door. And if she could, then the truth was simply that she had been with the wrong man. Back in the mall, the memory of that truth landed completely as Jun Hyuk finally stepped into the light. Travis's grip was still a violent reality, but the silence Jun Hyuk brought with him was more powerful than Travis's rage. It was the same silence from the gallery, absolute, protective, and entirely unfrightened by the weight of Maya's past. As June Hyuk's focused gaze found Travis's hand in her curls, Maya knew that the man who had seen her clearly in front of a broken painting was about to finish the story Travis had tried so hard to write for her. The cold marble floor beneath Maya's sandals seemed to hum with the same low-frequency dread that had occupied the final 2 years of her first marriage. As Travis's fingers tightened their hold on her hair, the word he had just hissed, lied, echoed with the familiar, jagged edge of his favorite accusation, that she had tricked him. It was a word he had used to reframe their entire history, turning their early, hopeful months into a calculated scheme she had supposedly run on him. He had looked at her across the solicitor's desk on the day they signed the papers with the easy confidence of a man who believed love was a transaction where he had been shortchanged. Maya remembered the weight of that word, tricked, and how it had acted like a slow-acting poison in her daily life. She had started sleeping poorly, her mind circling the drain of his certainty until she began to see her own body through his clinical, detached eyes, as a faulty appliance he was deciding whether to return. She had lost weight she hadn't intended to lose, her collarbones becoming sharp ridges under her skin, while she gained a quietness that made her stop calling her mother because the shame in her voice would have been too loud to hide. Travis had told her she had known all along she couldn't conceive and let him commit to a life she was incapable of giving him, a narrative she had folded herself smaller and smaller to accommodate. She had carried that accumulated damage like armor she no longer had to think about putting on, even after she met June Hyuk. Even during the 3 months after her wedding when she finally saw the 2 lines on the test in a locked bathroom, she had sobbed not just from joy, but from the sudden, violent disproof of the 4 years of shame Travis had forced her to carry. The problem had never been her. It had never been her body. Now, standing in the mall, she realized that Travis wasn't just angry. He was trying to activate that old, terrible distance she used to use to survive him. He wanted her to retreat into the woman who moved quickly and scrambled to satisfy his pride. But Maya's hand stayed firm against her stomach. A deliberate claiming of the space her child occupied as she watched the quiet Cooper version of Travis, the one who was always worse than the shouting version, realize that his leverage was evaporating. June Hyuk was nearly upon them now, his unhurried footsteps sounding like the final punctuation at the end of a sentence that had gone on far too long. He didn't need to announce himself. The room already knew to pay attention. As Travis's grip on her hair faltered under the weight of June Hyuk's focused, silent intensity, Maya felt the shame loosen, like a stone being worn away by water. She was no longer a woman being measured by what she lacked, but a woman protected by a man who had chosen to see her clearly from the very beginning. The mall's white marble seemed to stretch and thin, echoing with the same hollow reverberations as the rumors Travis had begun to lace through their shared social circles weeks before. As his hand tightened in her hair, Maya realized that this physical assault was merely the culmination of the character assassination he had been conducting in the dark. Travis hadn't gone quiet after their divorce. Instead, he had become louder, reframing the story until the original truth was buried under a calculated revision. He had started with mutual acquaintances, sending ripples of well-meaning concern through a friend of his new circle. The messages Maya had received were careful and apologetic, informing her that Travis was telling anyone who would listen that the pregnancy wasn't what it appeared to be. He was weaving a narrative where the timeline didn't add up, insinuating that Maya had been involved with someone, a gangster, as he whispered to the more curious, long before the papers were even finalized. He was positioning himself as the wronged party, the man whose wife had betrayed him, rather than the man who had sat in a car during her painful medical tests, because hospitals made him uncomfortable. Maya remembered reading those messages, standing in her kitchen with both hands pressed flat against the cool marble of the counter, just as she was doing now with her own body. She had told June Hyuk about the rumors that evening, watching as he closed his folders with a focused, controlled intensity that signaled he was already moving 3 steps ahead. June Hyuk hadn't responded with heat. He had simply observed that men like Travis get louder when they are scared. He told her that responding to rumors only gave them weight, and for a while, Maya had tried to inhabit that quiet confidence. But standing here, with Travis's face inches from hers, she could see the raw, disorganized thing underneath all his tailoring, wounded pride wearing grief's clothing. He wasn't just here for the baby. He was here to reclaim the audience he felt he was losing. He wanted to prove that she was the fraud he had always claimed, even as her body, now 6 months into a healthy, vibrant pregnancy, proved him a liar with every heartbeat. The bystanders in the mall remained frozen, a collective paralysis that allowed Travis to believe the rules didn't apply to him. But the air had changed, dropping that final degree that meant the time for talking was over. Jun Hyuk was no longer a figure in the distance. He was a silent, looming presence that made the luxury storefronts feel small. Travis's jaw worked, his eyes shifting from Maya's face to the man approaching with such unhurried, terrifying efficiency. The revision of the story was about to meet the reality of the man who had never once asked Maya to be smaller, and Travis Kane was entirely unprepared for the ending Jun Hyuk was about to write. The mall's white marble seemed to stretch and thin, echoing with the same hollow reverberations as the rumors Travis had begun to lace through their shared social circles weeks before. As his hand tightened in her hair, Maya realized that this physical assault was merely the culmination of the character assassination he had been conducting in the dark. Travis hadn't gone quiet after their divorce. Instead, he had become louder, reframing the story until the original truth was buried under a calculated revision. He had started with mutual acquaintances, sending ripples of well-meaning concern through a friend of his new circle. The messages Maya had received were careful and apologetic, informing her that Travis was telling anyone who would listen that the pregnancy wasn't what it appeared to be. He was weaving a narrative where the timeline didn't add up, insinuating that Maya had been involved with someone, a gangster, as he whispered to the more curious, long before the papers were even finalized. He was positioning himself as the wronged party, the man whose wife had betrayed him, rather than the man who had sat in a car during her painful medical tests, because hospitals made him uncomfortable. Maya remembered reading those messages, standing in her kitchen with both hands pressed flat against the cool marble of the counter, just as she was doing now with her own body. She had told Jun Hyuk about the rumors that evening, watching as he closed his folders with a focused, controlled intensity that signaled he was already moving 3 steps ahead. Jun Hyuk hadn't responded with heat. He had simply observed that men like Travis get louder when they are scared. He told her that responding to rumors only gave them weight, and for a while, Maya had tried to inhabit that quiet confidence. But standing here, with Travis's face inches from hers, she could see the raw, disorganized thing underneath all his tailoring, wounded pride wearing grief's clothing. He wasn't just here for the baby. He was here to reclaim the audience he felt he was losing. He wanted to prove that she was the fraud he had always claimed, even as her body, now 6 months into a healthy, vibrant pregnancy, proved him a liar with every heartbeat. The bystanders in the mall remained frozen, a collective paralysis that allowed Travis to believe the rules didn't apply to him. But the air had changed, dropping that final degree that meant the time for talking was over. Jun Hyuk was no longer a figure in the distance. He was a silent, looming presence that made the luxury storefronts feel small. Travis's jaw worked, his eyes shifting from Maya's face to the man approaching with such unhurried, terrifying efficiency. The revision of the story was about to meet the reality of the man who had never once asked Maya to be smaller, and Travis Kane was entirely unprepared for the ending Jun Hyuk was about to write. The mall's artificial light seemed to sharpen, catching the glint of the silver watch on Travis's wrist as his grip on Maya's hair tightened, but the fear that usually accompanied his presence was being crowded out by a cold, clinical truth. Maya realized then that the rage in Travis's eyes wasn't just about her pregnancy or his wounded pride. It was the frantic, cornered energy of a man running out of time. Jun Hyuk had revealed the architecture of this desperation 2 nights prior, sitting across from her at the kitchen table in the quiet, settled geography of their home. He had spent hours in his study, planning and processing information that had changed the shape of their problem from a domestic ghost story into a ledger of cold, hard numbers. Travis, he explained, had accumulated significant gambling debts over the last 3 years. $500,000 lost in private card games and loans from men who operated in the dark spaces between legitimate business and the syndicate. The mall confrontation wasn't just an impulsive outburst of anger. It was an opening move in a predatory calculation. Travis had spent 4 years making Maya feel ashamed for things she couldn't control, all while he was hiding a spiraling bankruptcy of his own making. He had approached men Jun Hyuk knew, not allies, but the dangerous middle ground of the underworld, to signal that he had something to offer in exchange for their investment. He was trying to leverage Maya's new life, her pregnancy, and the Park family name to wipe his own slate clean. Maya looked at Travis now, seeing past the tailored black suit and the muscular stance to the raw, disorganized thing underneath. He was a man who handed others his shame and called it truth, a man who had tried to turn her body into a transaction and was now trying to use her child as currency. "You're not here because you're hurt, Travis," Maya said, her voice dropping to a steady, observational register that she had learned from the man now standing just feet behind them. "You're here because you're broke." The flicker of genuine terror that crossed Travis's face confirmed everything June Hyuk had deduced. His rehearsed confidence act faltered, the professional sheen of his suit becoming irrelevant in a room where the rules had already been decided without his input. June Hyuk moved the final few inches, his presence dropping the temperature of the mall by a degree Maya could feel in her very marrow. Travis's fingers finally began to tremble in her curls, the realization sinking in that he hadn't just accosted his ex-wife. He had invited the scrutiny of a man who understood the difference between a threat and an unfinished debt. The transition from the sunlit luxury of the mall to the dim, cavernous silence of the warehouse felt like the closing of a heavy book. Travis Kane had arrived at the docks at 9 o'clock, dressing for the meeting as if appearance were still his primary armor, fitted jacket, polished shoes, and a jaw set with a desperate, lingering hope that he still possessed leverage. He had spent the drive over trying to convince himself that June Hyuk Park was a man like any other, someone who could be reasoned with or bargained into a compromise if approached with the right degree of confidence. But the moment he stepped into the warehouse, the body's primal understanding overrode the mind's delusions. The space was a vast pool of shadows, lit only by a single overhead source that carved out a circle of white light in the center of the room. June Hyuk stood in that light, his jacket gone and his sleeves pushed to the elbows, revealing the dense, elaborate ink that marked him as a man belonging to a world with its own brutal architecture of consequence. He was entirely still, his hands in his pockets, waiting with the unhurried patience of someone who had already decided the outcome before the first word was spoken. Travis stopped 6 feet away, his mouth dry, his rehearsed speech already dissolving in his chest. June Hyuk spoke first, his voice a flat, observational recording of a crime. "You touched my wife," he said, stating it not as an accusation but as a final punctuation. "In a public place, in front of witnesses, with your hand in her hair." "I needed information," Travis stammered, his voice sounding thin and brittle in the vast space. "You needed leverage," June Hyuk corrected, his tone dropping the temperature of the room by a degree Travis could feel in his bones. "Leverage implies you have something to trade. You don't." June Hyuk tilted his head slightly, mentioning the conversations he had already held with the men Travis owed money to, conversations in rooms Travis would never be invited into, where outcomes had been agreed upon without his input. The map Travis had been following was now irrelevant. He was in a different country entirely, one where his rights and his pride meant nothing. June Hyuk removed his hands from his pockets and crossed the distance between them slowly, stopping close enough that Travis had to fight the instinct to stumble backward. There was no performance of menace here, only the absolute absence of it, which was infinitely more terrifying. "Here is what happens now," June Hyuk said quietly. He gestured toward a folder of documents on a nearby table, a no-contact agreement that effectively turned Travis into a ghost and a transfer of his remaining assets, including the logistics stake and the property on Carver Street. It was a comprehensive stripping of everything Travis used to maintain his illusion of power. "You can't just," Travis began, but June Hyuk's gaze held him with a ferocious, private intensity. "The assets cover the debt and the inconvenience," June Hyuk continued, his voice dropping to a register that was controlled rather than emotional. "What covers the rest is that you leave. You leave the city, you leave the rumors, and you never again speak my wife's name or mention my child." The cold was now total, occupying every part of Travis as he realized the dimensions of his situation. He looked into the shadows at the periphery, where June Hyuk's men stood in silent, deliberate geometry, a reminder of the force that operated behind the calm. Travis signed the documents an hour later with a hand that shook despite his best efforts to appear composed. He was a man who had spent 4 years calling a woman broken, only to find himself thoroughly dismantled by the truth of who she had become and the man who protected her. As Travis stood to leave, Jun Hyuk leaned in one last time, his voice barely a whisper but echoing like a death sentence. "If you ever put your hands on her again," he said, "you won't have hands to touch her with next time." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise Jun Hyuk never intended to leave unfinished. The hospital room was a sanctuary of profound, heavy quiet, a stark contrast to the hollow, echoing luxury of the mall that had nearly dismantled her peace months before. The air here didn't carry the artificial scent of expensive perfume or the metallic tang of public fear. Instead, it held the sterile, honest smell of antiseptic and fresh linen. Jun Hyuk hadn't left her side since the first sharp pain had made her reach for him at the window, clearing his entire world the moment she whispered his name. He was a man built for the controlled application of will, yet he had stood in the long, rhythmic silence of her labor without a single complaint, letting her grip his hand with a force that had nothing restrained about it. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't look at the door. He simply kept his eyes on her face with the absolute attention of a man for whom only one thing in the world existed. The transition from the chaos of the mall to this clinical peace felt like the final closing of a heavy book. Maya remembered the way her heart had hammered against her ribs when Travis's hand was in her hair, the way the world had seemed to shrink down to the point of his fingers, and the heat of his rage. But as the hours of labor deepened, that memory began to thin, replaced by the reality of the man standing beside her. Jun Hyuk was not comfortable with helplessness. She knew that about him. He was a man who moved through the world with an unhurried posture and a stillness that suggested he had long ago stopped needing to perform composure. Yet, in this room, he had traded his power for presence, offering her a steadiness that didn't require her to be small. As the night wore on, the hum of the hospital equipment became the only soundtrack to her effort. Every contraction was a wave she had to climb, but every time she reached the peak, Jun Hyuk was the shore. He wiped the sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth, his movements precise and tender, a silent vow renewed with every touch. He didn't offer empty platitudes or performative encouragement. He offered the truth of his presence. He was the man who had faced down shadows in a warehouse without blinking. Yet here, he was a man who bowed his head in reverence to the strength she was displaying. When the baby finally arrived at 10 minutes past 2 in the morning, the first furious, magnificent announcement of her daughter's existence hit the room like something physical, a pressure that settled deep in Maya's chest. Maya felt the sound in her sternum and her throat simultaneously, and she was crying before she had processed the fact of it, tears running freely into her hair as the midwife placed the small, warm weight against her skin. The world rearranged itself permanently in that second around a new and specific gravity. She held her daughter and felt the particular, astonishing realness of her weight, a weight that didn't feel like a burden, but like a foundation. She looked up to see Jun Hyuk standing at the side of the bed, his usual mask of composed authority entirely gone. The man who had crossed a warehouse with lethal, cold efficiency was now looking at his daughter with an expression that was entirely unguarded. The composure that was so fundamental to how he moved through the world had simply been released, as if he had decided this was a room where he could afford to be seen completely. His jaw worked, and his eyes were bright with a moisture he didn't move to conceal. When she finally guided the baby into his arms, he held her with an absolute, settled quality, as if his hands had simply been waiting through the years for this specific moment to arrive. "Thank you," he whispered, the 2 words encompassing the gallery, the mall, the clinic, and the long, difficult work of unlearning the damage Travis had done. He didn't say, "I told you so," but as he looked from the baby's face to Maya's, the silent confirmation was there, the truth her own body had been waiting to tell her. Maya leaned back against the pillows, watching the man she had chosen walk slowly back and forth beside the bed, his daughter against his chest. She thought about the porcelain sink where she had washed dishes in a house that wasn't a home, the cold latte she had stared at in the cafe, and the word defective that she had carried so long it had started to feel like her own name. She thought about the bathroom floor and the 2 lines on a test that had triggered heaving sobs of relief. Disproven, every lie she had been told about her worth. The problem had never been her body. It had never been her. It had simply been the wrong man. She hadn't escaped into this life. She had built it from the rubble and the shame, refusing to apologize for the space she now occupied. She understood now that power and love were not opposites, that protection could feel like expansion rather than containment. The man she had married didn't require her smallness to maintain his size. He expanded the space around her, allowing her to be exactly who she was. She thought about the years she spent shrinking, the years she spent believing that love was a transaction she was failing to complete. She remembered Travis's voice in the kitchen, the clinical detachment in his eyes as he dismantled her piece by piece. That version of Maya was a ghost now, a shadow that had finally been chased away by the morning sun. In its place stood a woman who knew that her value wasn't tied to a doctor's report or a man's pride. Her value was in her resilience, in her capacity to love again, and in the life she now held in her arms. As the morning light began to touch the city outside, Maya felt the space where the shame had lived finally feel light, like a room where the windows had been opened after years of being shuttered. She watched Jun Hyuk press his face gently against the baby's forehead, the child's foot pressing back against his palm in a purposeful, distinct movement. It was the disproof of every word Travis had ever spoken, a reality that sat in her chest like something she finally had a word for: peace. She was Maya Park, wife, mother, protected, and whole. She was no longer a woman who answered to a toxic past or a man who used her worth as a weapon. She had walked through the fire and come out the other side knowing exactly what fire looked like, and she was never going back. Outside, the city continued in its unaware, indifferent way, entirely ignorant of the transformation that had occurred in this quiet room. But for Maya, the story had finally ended where it should have begun, with a man who saw her clearly and a child who was the proof that she had always been enough.